Parker Thune joining us once again on Inside the Huddle. Parker, what's going on, brother?
Not a lot. How are you, sir?
I can't complain, my man. I cannot complain. Look, make or break year for Brent Venables and company over in Norman, Oklahoma, as we get into team number 2 of our way too early predictions around the SEC. Parker, National Signing Day was today. No real additions needed for the Sooners. They got their 2 outside guys that they've been needing, especially after losing a lot of dudes in the receiver room. You guys obviously get Deion Burks back, but you bring in guys like Emmanuel Choice from Dallas and Elijah Thomas, 2 of the best athletes in the nation. Just talk to me about their impact and what they can create for this Brent Venables team that is obviously needing a prayer at this point going into next year.
Yeah, no doubt. Strong class for Oklahoma in 2025. Not a huge class, and so it doesn't rank very highly across the industry for lack of quantity. But, you bring up Elijah Thomas and Emmanuel Choice. Only 2 takes at wideout for Oklahoma, but they are 2 of the absolute best. Very much a believer that those 2 can contribute immediately, especially Thomas, who hails from Shakota, Oklahoma, about an hour and a half east of Norman. He has already blown it out of the water. I mean, blowing people away in winter workouts and testing sessions for Oklahoma. Athletically, he is the cream of the crop. So there's a lot of belief that a guy like that's going to be able to come in and contribute for an Oklahoma receiver room that's deep, but not terribly proven.
I agree. This is quite a young receiving room. Obviously, you lose a guy like Nick Anderson that goes to Baton Rouge that still has a lot to prove after coming off of an ankle injury. But yeah, I feel like this receiving room still has a lot of questions, but it all stems back to the quarterback play. You guys obviously get in Jackson Arnold, or not Jackson Arnold. You lose Jackson Arnold. Now you bring in Ben Arbuckle. You also bring in John Mateer, one of the best play callers in college football, one of the best dual threat quarterbacks in college football. I was listening to a show earlier, and they were saying, Mike Hawkins was going to create some competition. And look, I'm not saying he won't, but let's just be honest. We all know what's going to happen. When you get an OC and a Q from the same college, we all know what's going to happen. Plugging into this system in Oklahoma with, the lack of depth, what happened last year with the offensive line, how they kind of broke down early in the season. Just talk to me about the impact that Mateer is going to make immediately once he steps foot in Norman, Oklahoma, and in this Oklahoma Sooners offense, and what's to expect from him in the spring.
Yeah, well, quarterback play wasn't very strong for Oklahoma in 2024. I think that's pretty well known. To a certain extent, it couldn't be helped because the supporting cast for whoever Oklahoma's signal caller was, whether it was Arnold or at times during the season Hawkins, it was ravaged by injury. But John Mateer led the FBS with 44 total touchdowns last season. He's a guy that's from Little Elm, Texas, just 2 hours south of Norman, so he gets to come back a lot closer to home. I think the reunion with his offensive coordinator at Wazoo, Ben Arbuckle, is quite significant because he doesn't have to learn anything new. He comes in with a very detailed understanding of the system, everything that he's going to be asked to do for Oklahoma, and obviously he's incredibly talented. The belief is that he plugs in at Oklahoma. He and Arbuckle plug in together. You're going to be able to overcome whatever personnel deficiencies you still may have offensively. Look at that tight end room. There's a lot of question marks there. Again, receiver, running back. The answers are there, no doubt. There's a lot of good depth. You just don't really know at this point who's going to emerge. But or at least you feel like the quarterback situation, the quarterback position is not one that you're going to have to worry about because Mateer comes in more than capable of helping Oklahoma win football games in 2025, in particular because of his familiarity with the system. It's not going to be a square peg in a round hole. He's going to be very comfortable with everything that he's asked to do for the Sooners.
Do you think he's going to get limited a good bit, especially at the start of the year, especially when you have a young offensive line that's probably going to come in? I know you guys got the number 1 offensive tackle in the class of 25 that could be a plug-and-play guy in there.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think he's going to be limited by the offensive line. I also don't have the expectation that the number 1 tackle you referenced, Michael Fasusi, is a plug-and-play guy because very few guys are on the offensive line. I would think the hope is that you can redshirt him. Really, the Sooners just have to get their guys healthy again, which they will. Jake Sexton and Jake Taylor, who opened the season as Oklahoma's 2 starting tackles, both missed substantial time. And so you're going to get those guys healthy again. Troy Everett started the season on the shelf at center. When he reemerged midseason and got healthy again, at that point, it was kind of too little too late for that Oklahoma offense. But he's been a consistently reliable option. The battle at both guard spots is going to be very, very interesting because Fabechi Wiwu, a former North Texas transfer, is a guy that's an incumbent at one of those spots, but I'm not necessarily handing a job to him. There are some really, really talented offensive linemen that are going to push him for that spot, as well as the other guard spot. Heath Ozida is going to be in the mix. Eddie Pierre-Louis is going to be in the mix. There's a chance the Sooners could slide Taylor back inside to guard and mess around with a guy like Isaiah Autry-Dent or transfer Derek Simmons from Western Carolina at right tackle. So again, it's kind of akin to the conversation at wide receiver and at running back where you feel confident that the answers are there. You're just not sure exactly what it's going to look like, but it's not a question of whether there is talent there. There's quite a bit of it.
You know, this back seven, especially on Oklahoma's defense, is going to take a hit. You obviously lose Billy Bowman. You obviously lose Danny Stutzman. But you bring back the Bowen twins, Eli and Peyton, who were staples at safety and corner. What has their impact been, especially last year? Because I know I probably didn't get to see a whole lot of Oklahoma, but talk to me about their impact and what they bring to that back seven.
Yeah, they're both incredibly talented. And Peyton had issues staying healthy last year. He was dealing with a nagging ankle injury for much of the season, so didn't feel quite the impact that you maybe expected from Peyton Bowen, but he's one of the most gifted safeties in all of college football when he is at full health, and I expect that you're going to see that from him in 2025. Going to see what he's capable of. Somebody with Thorpe Award ability, if it all breaks right for him. He can be every bit the player that Billy Bowman was, and then some. He's that gifted. And, you know, you look at his younger brother, Eli Bowen, who kind of flew under the radar to an extent as he was overshadowed throughout the recruiting process by his older brother. They're only a year apart. And so Eli's the younger one. He's the shorter one. And so I don't know that he ever really got his due as a recruit, but anybody that watched him play in high school, and I got the chance to watch them both on several occasions, understood that he was not going to be in over his head. As soon as he stepped foot on a college campus, he would be ready to contribute. He was for Oklahoma, worked himself into a starting role by midseason, and for the most part was lights out. His limiting factor is that height. He's only 5'9", and so there are some receivers, if he's matched up with a guy who's 6'4", like for instance, Theo Weiss at Missouri got the better of him on a jump ball in the corner of the end zone in Missouri's 30-23 victory over Oklahoma this past fall, which, that's just going to happen. He's not going to win every single matchup. He's not going to win every single rep, but more often than not, he's going to be able to hold his own against some of the best wide receivers in the SEC. So he is one guy that you can count on, that Oklahoma knows they can count on to be one of their starting cornerbacks in 2025. And you can just kind of forget about his side of the field. It's going to be on lockdown.
Staying on the defensive side of the ball, Brent Venables finally announcing that he will take over defensive play calling. Obviously, it's hard, especially for Oklahoma. You're replacing a pretty solid DC in Zach Alley that's now back with Rich Rodriguez at West Virginia. But it's quite fascinating to me ever since Brent Venables has gotten there. You're now on your third straight OC and your third straight DC, if I stand corrected.
You're correct.
And so you're looking at this, and what do you think made Brent Venables just say, you know what, I am calling defense next year. I don't want to hire a guy that has DC coordinator experience, and I don't want to elevate any of my position coaches as that next DC. What made him just go through that?
The combination of two very simple factors. One, the reality that he knows the defense better than anybody because it's his defense. And so I think there's a part of him that believes, rightfully so, and I believe it, that he is better suited to call the plays in his defensive scheme than any of his assistants would be, as well as the fact that it's a prove-it year for him in 2025 and his entire staff. And so My man, JD Piquel, a longtime friend of mine who works at On3 Sports, made a really good analogy. He said, this is the equivalent of Brent Venables calling for the ball in the fourth quarter, because that's what it is for Oklahoma in 2025. It's the fourth quarter. It's crunch time. They have to win. And I think Brent Venables understands that if they're going to win, they have to play very strong defensive football, and he's willing to shoulder the load. And I think that's a prospect that most Oklahoma fans are pretty comfortable with, knowing what he's done in the past as a defensive play caller. And so if it wasn't going to be Jim Knowles, and Oklahoma made a long, hard run at Jim Knowles to try and be their defensive coordinator. After that all kind of fell through and he wound up going to Penn State, it was apparent that, okay, it's going to be Venables' show in 2025, and that's probably for the best.
Do you think that if things don't change, is Oklahoma and the boosters willing to pay the $35 million this year, or do they wait after 26 to pay the $26 million, or do they let it ride out until the end of its extension?
Well, it depends on how things go next year. And how much do things change? Because if they go 6-7 again, or 7-6, somewhere around 500, man, it feels like you're kind of in that twilight zone where you don't have objective cause to fire a guy because it hasn't been bad, and there have been things that have happened that are out of his control. But at the same time, it's not the standard at Oklahoma. It's not what people expect. It's not what the fans expect. And so that might be a really tough conversation and a tough ordeal if Oklahoma is somewhere in that 6-7, 7-6 range. You're kind of looking at a scenario like you had this past year with Billy Napier and Florida, where half the fan base probably thinks this is over, let's move on, let's start new. And then half the fan base thinks, no, it's too soon to pull the plug. Let's see what he can do with another year. And with that said, I think 8 wins is enough to secure him another season in 2026. Anything short of that, and you certainly have a conversation on your hands. I mean, if it's just catastrophically bad, they go 3-9, they go 4-8, okay, then you have to make
right.
change. And I get that. But 8 wins is probably what ensures Brent Venables is back in 2026.
Okay. I want to get your thoughts on this too, Parker. Last offseason, he signs the extension.
Yep.
After one 10-win season. And after 2 years, you already extended the guy. And I like how you mentioned the tradition at Oklahoma, just the overall history of it as well. You're talking about an Oklahoma team that is regularly expected to contend for Big 12 or now SEC championships, in the past Big 12 championships, regardless. And you sign a guy that goes 10-3, and you end up basically the second half of the year. What was impressive about them? Your defense was a disaster. Your bowl game was a disaster. You gave a guy an extension because you beat your rival? How does this make any sense? And you look, Parker, you can disagree, and that's fine. They should have never given him that extension. I thought it was a disastrous move. I thought it was a terrible decision. It would have saved administration a lot of money, especially after what you've seen, just the amount of inconsistency. So this is a make or break year, because the administration basically screwed themselves when they said, hey, we're going to give you an extension after just one 10-win season, and you've only been here 2 years. How does that make sense?
Well,
please explain that.
No, it's okay. And I think there's a lot of validity to what you said. I think there are plenty of folks, even diehard Sooners, that would agree the extension was premature. And it probably was. Now, did the administration screw themselves? We don't know the answer yet. They could have. Absolutely. They could have extended a guy that is in over his head as a head coach and is floundering and is well on his way to an early firing and a hefty buyout and a role on somebody's staff somewhere as an analyst. Or it could just as well be the fact that what happened in 2024 couldn't really be helped with as many injuries as Oklahoma had to deal with. It's not indicative of what the program actually is under Venables' direction, and they're going to rebound in a major way in 2025. Either of those things may be true. So I don't think anybody would argue that. Certainly as of right now, that extension looks very premature at best, but let's see what happens in 2025, when you would expect that the ridiculously bad injury luck that Oklahoma encountered in 2024 is not repeated, because chance demands that there be some regression to the mean there. So we'll find out this year, no doubt. I think by the end of the season, we'll have a verdict on the on whether that extension was a wise decision or not.
Parker Thune, the ref, joining us here on Inside the Huddle. Really fast, Parker, before we let you go for today, let's look at our schedule for Oklahoma. You start off at Illinois. It's a favorable non-conference schedule for the most part, but the big one there, I think you're going to get an early look at where this team is at when you guys play Michigan. You've got to go up against the number one player in Bryce Underwood. You got a lot of question marks on your defense. How will Brent Venables attack as a new play caller on your defense? Realistic expectations. I said that this was probably a 7-8 win team. I do believe that if you can finish 500 in the SEC, which is not out of the question, I think Tennessee, I think South Carolina, Alabama could be a game that you could steal. Home-wise, LSU, Auburn, Missouri, even a young Ole Miss team. I think that those games could be considered trap. Texas is a question mark, obviously, in the Red River. But realistically, where do you see this team at the end of the year?
Yeah, so if I'm going to glance at this schedule here, I think Oklahoma starts 4-0, clean sweep and non-con. I give them the edge over Michigan because they're at home. If that game was played in Ann Arbor, I would probably go with Michigan. They feel like two teams that are on a similar level. I think the home field advantage helps Oklahoma get over the hump there. If you're trying to pick out SEC wins and get Oklahoma to that 8-win threshold, I think you start with Missouri. That should be a win. Should have been a win for Oklahoma this past year. They managed to choke that one away in Columbia. So that should be a win. I would say Auburn in Norman should be a win, and there's certainly going to be some familiarity with the guy that's trotting out there to play quarterback for Auburn. So you would expect that Oklahoma is going to be well equipped to defend him. South Carolina, once again, should be a win. That is a game that just completely got away from Oklahoma in the first 5 minutes. I mean, it's tough to script a worse first 5 minutes of a football game than the one that Oklahoma experienced in Norman against South Carolina, and it resulted in Seth Luttrell's firing as offensive coordinator. So I get the sense that Oklahoma is going to go on the road, especially with what happened last year in the rearview mirror, and find a way in Columbia, South Carolina. So I like them to win that game. And then looking at the rest of that schedule, I mean, you have to expect it's the SEC, right? It's a meat grinder, ton of parity. There always is. Anybody can beat anybody any given week. And the asterisk with that statement was always, well, besides Vanderbilt, up until this last year when Vanderbilt beat Alabama and proved that they're not the doormat in the SEC anymore. So I think looking at the rest of that schedule, LSU, Ole Miss, Alabama, Tennessee, Texas, there's an 8th win there somewhere. I can't necessarily point to the game in particular and tell you, yep, that's a win. But looking at those 5 games, I feel pretty confident that Oklahoma is going to be able to snag at least one of them.
The biggest one I like to see, Alabama. The biggest reason why you guys won it, the option game of Jackson Arnold. Who do you have in? The number one dual threat quarterback in this transfer portal cycle. Parker Thune joining us. Catch him out on the ref out in Norman, Oklahoma, 12-3 Eastern time, or are we talking Central time?
Central. We're in the Central time zone in Oklahoma.
Parker, appreciate you joining us again. You can follow him at Parker Thune. Covers all things Sooners, recruiting, the portal, also part of Rivals.com as well. Parker, thank you for joining us once again, my man. Have a great rest of the week and have a great, great weekend.